So I am going to raise here the question of media manias or media manias from a media archaeological point of view. So I will not have time to talk in detail here about what this thing called media archaeology means, but let me mention that I'm one of the people who's been trying to develop this as a sort of like no longer new approach to studying media, starting in the early 1990s. So the other two figures linked with this longer tradition are German, so Siegfried Zielinski and Friedrich Kittler. So we did communicate over the years many times about these ideas. So in this speech, so the theory of media archaeology comes more like through these examples that I'm going to talk about. And however, I have discovered that one way of characterizing media archaeology, the kind of way I do understand it, is actually to go back to Mark Twain, who wrote this highly interesting thing. So he wrote, "There's no such thing as a new idea. It is impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope. We give them a turn and they make new and curious combinations. We keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely, but they are the same old pieces of colored glass that have been used throughout the ages." So, is this really so? You may recall what happened exactly 1 year ago. At UCLA, where I teach, so our sculpture garden suddenly was covered by young people and a little bit older people in actions like you see on the screen. And when I tried to go to these people to ask about what they were seeing, really, what are you doing? They said, "Wait, there goes another one." And they run. So obviously, a mania was taking place. And the mania was actually identified by the internet as a mania. Pokemonkomania became a highly searchable keyword on the internet. So there were many of those who were feeling that a mania was all of a sudden raging, a mania that then disappeared to at least an extent within a number of weeks. And obviously some of you, I believe, were part of it. Mania is an interesting concept to look at within the context of media culture. And 19th century saw a lot of scientific and medical research on what it is. What is a mania? For example, this one, or the book by Alexander Morrison, which deals with cases of mental disease, makes also frequent references to things that we link with media culture. I'm not going to go into these details of what medically characterizes mania. I'm just kind of interested in this quotation I took from the book to look at the very final part. So which says that the mania, one of the things that characterizes mania is that there is an irresistible tendency to motion. The muscular power is frequently increased, and there's a strong disposition to act from the impulse of the moment. Exacerbations of excitement giving rise to fits of fury are frequent. And certainly it did feel at times that some of these qualities were being activated by what was happening when people were running after inexistent virtual monsters And I think everybody remembers some of those things. I actually couldn't believe my luck when this thing all of a sudden appeared, and I was just about to finish that long chapter on Manias. So that is one explanation why I started trying to run after these people with highly minimal success. But I did collect a lot of material from the internet, and I already published a study about this, but I only published it in Japan, in Japanese language, so that's the only study that I published. I was invited by, my new book is actually only in Japanese, so I have published just a large book in Japanese on media archaeology in Tokyo. Okay. So, Manias have been linked with events, phenomena like that for a very long time, much longer time than something we might call media culture has taken place. And some of you may know this wonderful Victorian classic, a book by Charles Mackay called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. This is a highly important and readable book to think about in the context of our contemporary media culture, because it tries to make sense on a massive level about what happens and why when certain kind of ideas go sort of like out of control and reach masses of people. For example, this book talks much about medieval dancing manias, when all of a sudden, seemingly without an explanation, groups of people start dancing around and the thing starts spreading. 19th century, as I mentioned, so many such manias, and just to mention very few, pyromania, thieving mania or kleptomania, dipsomania, suicidal mania, narcomania, nymphomania, and so on. With Pokemon Go, I think some people found explanations by linking it with religion. This is certainly what the anthropologist Hannah Gould did in this really interesting article published in the Guardian newspaper. The idea of Pokemon mania somehow triggered by religion, however, is a relatively complex idea, because we could say that depending on culture, so this relationship, whether that is somehow part of it, was manifested in very different ways. In Japan, as I have found out during my long experience with that culture, I've been visiting probably over 30 times in the past 20 years and published many texts in Japan and been teaching there. So the culture is still deeply permeated with a certain kind of animistic quality. So this means not only looking at like popular cultural figures in terms of certain kind of animism, but stones and elements of nature and things like that is part of this sort of like Shinto sort of like background in Japan. So the idea that all of a sudden you have little virtual monsters that first, of course, appeared 20 years ago when the Pokemon game was introduced by Nintendo company and then turned into collectible cards and many other forms of popular culture. So that idea is easier simply to link with the idea of the sort of like the kind of mania that spread around this habit 20 years later. Obviously there were generations already of people who knew that. So it had already been sort of like spreading in culture. So in Japan, it is not rare to find shrines dedicated to unusual objects. So my favorite shrine is in Tokyo. It's dedicated to daikon, where people go to worship vegetables. I always go there every time to look at my favorite piles of daikons that people are bringing there. But there are also shrines for anime fans and for many different kinds of things. In the West, people might say that somehow the Pokemon Go mania has to do with a certain kind of disappearance of this kind of sense of the spiritual, and sort of like finding that sort of like vacuum that has developed and filling it with this kind of virtual action taking place within this kind of physical spaces in the society. There probably are many other explanations we could add to those things. This is a wonderful 19th century source called Fleur de Manie by le Marquis de Grange de Surgère. Fleur de Manie ou notice des imprimés de toute nature. This is an extensively long list of all kinds of possible manias that were experienced and documented in the 19th century. One of them, number 60 in this list, is called the kaleidoscomanie. And now I want to link, or try to link, Pokemon Go mania with the mania created by this particular device that I think that many of you know, probably your children know, and many of you may own one of these devices. In 1822, the press or the literary chit-chat wrote, while Brewster each one's optic nerves delights by his famed peep show and its varying sights. We talk about famous Scottish scientist, Sir David Brewster, here in the most famous picture, who patented the device called the kaleidoscope in 1817. So this device that you surely know was actually an outcome of scientific efforts to understand certain ideas about cathode tricks. So Brewster himself was in a very interesting place because he was highly influenced by the 17th century tradition of so-called natural magic, but he was also trying to sort of like bend these ideas towards utilitarian goals. So finding practical uses for these kind of scientific ideas that bridge the sort of like in a long way the scientific revolutions that took place around the early modern age. So this little picture tube that you know produced infinite combinations of elements by means of mirrors inside the tube. So originally two mirrors placed at an angle, which combined with little trinkets or pictures or many different kinds of things placed inside the tube produced this kind of hallucinating infinite reflection spaces. He wrote a book about that early on, and this is the later printing, 1858, where he was trying to show how this device, this is by the way the front and the back of the original David Brewster kaleidoscope from my collection. So I do actually have a large collection. David Wilson often comes to my place to look at my I have a large collection of optical antiques from the early 18th century up to only the beginning of the 20th century, nothing after that. So Brewster wrote in the patent, this instrument is constructed in such a manner as either to please the eye by an ever-varying succession of splendid tints and symmetrical forms, or to enable the observer to render permanent such as may appear most appropriate for any of the branches of the ornamental arts. So it was actually meant as a certain kind of a natural magic-like device to create wonder, but at the same time it has this sort of like anticipated the positivistic science of the 19th century, where they were looking for applications. So this would be used for fabric designers, graphic designers, to look at symmetrical patterns, and that exactly is one of the ways in which kaleidoscopes were turned into a practical device. So it always has this interestingly sort of like varied nature that bridged a lot of material somehow like taking off from those scientific principles behind that device. So some more pictures of the device. So this actually it was modeled on the telescope. So this is the telescopic kaleidoscope. So you spread it out just like it was made by scientific instrument makers like Philip Carpenter in London, Birmingham and London. And actually it had a series of different cells with different combinations of elements which you could fit into that device. So instead of looking at the stars, you were looking at these inner worlds that kept on changing abstractly when you rotated that device. Of course, as often in the history of inventions, as soon as this word started spreading, others came out and claimed to have invented exactly the same or similar device and a few months before Brewster. Or even centuries before, like this book claimed, so pointing out this invention called the garden flats by Richard Bradley, which was described in a book on gardening and planting in 1717, where you would take two mirrors and place them on a patterned surface, and you see how the patterns were multiplied. So obviously a device for coming up with ideas for garden designing. But as Brewster soon noted, this actually went much further back. We heard about Athanasius Kircher and Kircher's theatrical mirrors from the 17th century, which were definitely part of the world of natural magic. Or Giambattista della Porta's theatrical or amphitheatrical mirrors from the 1589, which seen from above, in this case, produces an infinite reflection space. Something, again, that had been even earlier described by Leonardo da Vinci in his notebooks. You see the person here surrounded by mirrors, creating this kind of like an inner space extending infinitely to all directions. So instead of being put into that kind of situation, so what happened was something incredible, or seemingly incredible. I'm trying to look at my, do I still have a little bit? Good. So this is what Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine wrote in June 1818. So about a year after that patent had been taken. In the memory of man, no invention or no work, whether addressed to the imagination or to the understanding, ever produced such an effect. A universal mania for the instrument seized all classes, from the lowest to the highest, for the most ignorant to the most learned, and every person not only felt but expressed the feeling that a new pleasure had been added to their existence. So what do we mean? We do mean the phenomenon that there was not a single person in the societies in Europe without this little device in their pocket. But instead of putting them on their ear or starting to grab them with their fingers, they were mesmerized. They stopped on the street staring into that little tube. Crazy things started happening. Traffic accidents. Chaos. When all of these people stopped and just became mesmerized. And not only that, because if we look a little bit more closely, we see that a certain kind of family imagination started appearing. So if you help a lady to look better focused the kaleidoscope, things happen. And what about the husband? And here again, look at where the kaleidoscope salesman points his products. So the kaleidoscope produced a huge, interesting iconographic evidence that kind of a mania was actually happening, taking place. This is a wonderful print. I don't have the time to go into these details, but you see a typical dandy, so sort of flaneur, dandy in the streets of Paris, who just comes to the city from the countryside, tries to be look at as fashionable as he can, and of course he's full of himself. So he looks at the beautiful young Parisian lady, and of course he thinks this lady is looking at me, and he tries to start talking to the lady. Lady said, "I don't care about you. I'm looking at these beautiful flowers in my garden." So obviously showing that the point here is that this makes this guy look like a newcomer who did not know anything about the latest fashion. Or this one, where you see several variations of the theme. So you see always somebody immersed into this device and the wife being courted by the beautiful, the handsome dandies. And here one of them is already leaving the place. And not only is this happening to humans, monkeys are looking into what they think is a kaleidoscope, which is the long tail, trying to peek inside the tail. And this is what happened in the Palais Royal. This is the gardens of the Palais Royal, one of the most famous places for kind of passing one's evenings. The same motive happening again. But if you look at closely these prints, you see there's another effect here. Not only is this obscene thing happening, but these guys are having their big pockets picked. So something is upsetting the normal social balance and norms about perception and sort of like living within a society, and this is caused to a certain extent by these devices. Okay, I'm trying to get to the end right now. But again, media archaeology can show that this idea goes back much further. This is Ben Jonson, Bartholomew Fair, where one of the characters in the play was a pickpocket operating in the local fairs, and which could be linked to this pickpocket theme, how it became connected with this idea. So we talk about crowds, we talk about devices, certain habits. I'm trying to go very quickly. We have other examples. These are what I call topos traditions. And this is the French version around 1900, which introduces a homoerotic theme. So the guy gets overly excited by a peep show device, which is linked with this tradition, and the pickpocket here seems to be actually doing something else than merely stealing his pocket watch. So big question what media archaeology would deal with, whether the kaleidoscopania really happened. So we have a huge amount of fragments, textual fragments, visual fragments that make the claim. But it is 200 years ago. We never probably will fully know the extent of this excitement. So it's a discursive phenomenon, but to what extent a discursive phenomenon was linked with something really physically, concretely happening, we don't fully know. There were also writers who tried to explain why this thing happened. So this explanation for the mania. And one of these ideas had to do with the political and social circumstances. This was after the Napoleonic Wars. There was no exciting topics in the news which would create a certain kind of vacuum that would explain why this kind of little device could potentially become such an object of attention. Maybe also the interest of immersion, getting to another world, like through the pearly gates of cyberspace, like Margaret wrote in her famous book on the virtual reality fame, virtual reality Even so, we could actually, and now I'm really going so we could look at many other manias with similar type of things. Stereoscopic 3D created a mania too, several decades later, when these things were sold, and the same motives of wives being stolen by the door-to-door stereo view salesman appeared again. So we have what I call a topos, a motive that runs all the way through media culture, tries to give an explanation for these ideas. And finally, I'll show you 1 minute video without the comments. But my comment here in the coda says, round and round we go in the topos cycles of history. So when you look at my final example from 2010, think about what I just explained. Sound up, please.
Really?
Really?
It's time for a phone to save us from our phones. New Windows Phone, designed to get you in and out and back to life.